Her name is Elizabeth or Helen. Probably. Her age is 120 or 150 years old. Probably. And she has a massive, diabolical plan to... But to understand why we don't know what we don't know, we first need to understand why we do know what we do know. And if your brain is still working after that sentence, then that means you're ready to meet the real Administrator. Administrator is introduced to us in one of the very first official comics released, doing what she does best, being the omnipresent commander of the red and blue teams. And it's not long before we get our very first look at her, a cigarette-smoking older woman with a distinctive white streak in the front centre of her hair. And make a mental note of both the smoking habit and the white streak, because they're going to be very important later on. Whilst the majority of the introductory comic is focused on showing her as a powerful manipulator, the writers immediately set her up as someone with a mysterious background by including this sneaky little image within an image within an image. Because just a few months before this comic was released, in TF2's first ever lore dump, we were given these two documents. The Last Will and Testament of Zephaniah Mann, who was the original founder of Mann Co, and we'll meet him in detail in a future episode in this series, as well as this torn up family portrait. The initial release of Zephaniah's will mentions 4 people: his idiot twin sons, Redmond and Blutarch, his tracker and aide, Barnabas Hale, all of which we'll also meet in future episodes, and his faithful maidservant, Elizabeth. It's also important to note here that a later released version of the will reveals a third Mann brother, Grey, who goes on to be the main antagonist throughout the story and who we'll talk about a lot more as this episode goes on. But importantly, he is not yet in the family portrait. Whilst none of the people who are in the portrait are labelled directly, we do know from future comics that they are indeed who they logically appear to be. And it goes without saying that Elizabeth bears a striking resemblance to the Administrator who the TF2 writers reveal to us just a few months apart. From the jagged eyebrows, the scornful expression, to of course the large bouffant hair, white streak in the middle, and the fact that a copy of this family portrait is very intentionally shown on the Administrator's desk in the very first comic that we meet her, there is a very strong suggestion that these are the same person. But here's the thing. The events of TF2 take place around 1972, and Zephaniah Mann, this guy who is apparently alive in this family portrait, died in 1850. So the Administrator and Elizabeth can't possibly be the same person, right? This conundrum is only compounded further when Saxton Hale, again, who we'll meet in a future video, receives a phone call from Miss Pauling, Administrator's assistant, and assumes that the person on the other end is someone named Helen. Miss Pauling then responds by saying that she works for Miss with the surname cut off. Now Miss Pauling is seemingly referring to her boss, the Administrator here, implicitly confirming the Administrator's name as Helen. Now I'm not going to cover them all here, but there are numerous other Helen mentions throughout the comics, culminating in Pauling directly addressing Administrator to her face as Helen. Ultimately, there's very little room left for argument. Administrator's name is Helen. So if the Administrator is Helen, who the hell is Elizabeth? To understand her identity any further, we first need to understand her age. The story of the main TF2 comics largely revolves around one thing: obtaining the in-universe precious metal Australium and using its power to extend a person's life. Now, it is suggested that Australium's powers go beyond just extending life, but that is the primary use in the story. In the comic loose canon, we meet a cigarette-smoking Elizabeth in 1850, and then in 1890, 40 years later, a suspiciously similar-looking woman, also with cigarette. Now, whilst it could be assumed that the woman in 1890 is simply a relative of Elizabeth, it is in fact confirmed as being one and the same person, Elizabeth herself, in the pages of the catch-up comic. In the unredacted version of Zephaniah's will that we mentioned earlier, we learned that Elizabeth was left his supply of miracle gravel, which we can reasonably assume is Australium given the context, and we can therefore assume that Elizabeth has been using it to defy aging since it was left to her when Zephaniah died in 1850, and thus the reason that 40 years later she doesn't appear to have aged. That does, however, mean that up until 1850, she is probably been aging normally. Now, obviously we're looking at a stylized comic book drawing here, so it won't be possible to get an accurate read on her age. But if we're being generous, we could estimate that she's anywhere from as young as 30 to maybe as old as 60, at the time that she appeared to stop aging in 1850. That means that her birth year could be as early as 1790 or as late as 1820. That will be important later on. And at this point, it's still not completely apparent whether Administrator and Elizabeth are the same person. Perhaps then we can work out the answer to this question if we know when Administrator, or Helen, was born, or how long she's been alive. Fortunately, that information is told to us in relatively direct language. A few times, she and her is said to have been active for 150 years, and we do at one point see the burned remains of an 1850 census with the name Helen that Administrator had asked Miss Pauling to destroy. 150 years before 1972, which is the year TF2's present-day events take place, in other words, this picture in the comic, is 1822, which happens to be the exact year that Redmond, Blutarch, and Grey Mann were born. Hold that factoid in mind, because we'll touch on it again in just a moment. First, though, it's worth acknowledging that these are census records and not birth records specifically, meaning that Helen was born in 1850 or any time before. We only know that she was alive in that year. Given that we know that Elizabeth was also alive and known publicly as Elizabeth in 1850 based on Zephaniah's will, how could Helen be on public records in the same year if they are the same person? Now, of course, this could be as simple as she's simply hiding her real name from one group of people or the other, but it could also be so much more. The clues to Administrator's ultimate identity may be hidden in her grand plan. Her reason for commanding the mercs for all these years, harvesting all the Australium, and for prolonging her life in the first place. Because it seems that simply living forever is not her ultimate objective. When Saxton Hale's rival Charles Darling talks about her living 150 years, he's left asking, why? Pauling, who has never apparently undergone any life extending herself, says on multiple occasions that she knows Administrator has been planning something for her entire life, and Pauling wants to be along for the ride, but concedes she doesn't know what the plan is. Grey Mann, on the other hand, Administrator's ultimate enemy throughout most of the comics, implies that he does know what the plan is, and that it's not something good. And in a near-death experience that Pauling has, the writers imply that Administrator is out for blood. But the real info dump comes from Administrator herself in the very last few panels of comic we have ever received. She says the plan isn't just for her, and that she's got an old debt to settle. She thinks at one point she was done, either completed the plan or given up trying. She says that she craves something as much now as she did when she was a child, and that she will never stop wanting it. And finally, she thinks that she can resolve whatever this debt is in just 1 hour of Australian field life that she reduces herself down to at the very end. At this point in the story, almost everyone other than the playable mercs is dead. Grey Mann, her persistent rival throughout the comics, is dead and no longer a threat. Redmond and Blutarch, the people who she initially employed the mercs to essentially help torture for as long as possible, are also dead. And Zephaniah, the man who generously left Elizabeth his wealth and Australium in his will, at this point died over 100 years ago. Who could the Administrator, Helen, possibly owe a debt to? I said earlier to remember the year of Redmond, Blutarch, and Grey's birth, 1822. Exactly 150 years from present-day TF2. 150 years is the only time we ever get a reference to the Administrator's age outside of knowing that she was alive in 1850. Is it possible that Administrator was born at the same time as the 3 Mann sons? Could she even be a Mann sister? Or, if Zephaniah had an affair with his maid Elizabeth, or simply a relationship with her after his wife's death, Could Elizabeth and Helen actually be different people after all? And Helen Elizabeth's daughter? If we assume for a moment that the answer to that last question is yes, then could the debt that the administrator, Helen, so desperately wants to repay be one to her mother? If Helen was alive before 1850, then why does Gray only want the 1850 census and not any year before that? Does he know that that was actually the year that Helen was born, and it's actually information about her parents that he was hoping to find in the birth records? It's worth noting that whilst in Gray's scene, these records are referred to as a census, but in Miss Pauling's scene, they're called genealogy records. An insignificant synonym or an intentional hint as to what Pauling and Administrator are actually trying to hide? I posit that not only are Helen and Elizabeth different people, but that they are also both still alive. The exhibits for the Hale and Mann families are both under construction. Let me know which one you would like to visit first, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to be the first to know when they open.